Hey everyone, welcome back to Bending Boundaries, a podcast sponsored by the Northwest Social Science Doctoral Training Partnership, which straddles topics of equality, diversity and inclusion within universities and doctoral education.
In this podcast, we talk about the amazing new research being done by PhD researchers, and we discuss our experiences of being parts of groups who are not often represented within academia.
With monthly guest interviews, we discuss a variety of themes which relate to the research being done by PhD students. In today's episode, I interview Malika about her work on women in academia, and we discuss the theme of equity, equality, going back into a PhD after having worked in industry for years, and the emotions that are connected with that. But before that, let's have a quick catch up.
So, guys, how have you been? What have you been up to this week? Oh, actually, sorry, the question is, what are the best and worst parts of your week? Seren, do you want to go first?
Okay, the best part of my week was probably that I actually wrote something for the first time in ages for my PhD. It's been a long time, and it was very much a little word vomit, but I actually made me feel like good about it again because I've had a bit of time out. That was probably the best bit. The worst bit, quite hard to know. Nothing like that very bad has happened this week, which is good. You know, we cherish those weeks. It's just very cold. The usual British complaint is the weather.
The weather's definitely dropped over the last week or two. That is okay. Global warming's calmed down for a minute, and now it's cold again.
Yeah.
Reminds me of the song "Baby, It's Cold Outside" because it's very, very cold.
Nice and cozy.
My
cozy
goodness.
Vibes. What about you, Ebru? Have you done? What are the best and worst parts of your week?
The worst part of my week, I don't even know. It's been such a busy week, and I feel like at the same time, time passes by so slow when you start the day. At the same time, we're at the end of November. But I think the worst part just has been that lots of meetings got rescheduled or canceled. So that forced me to reschedule many days last minute, which was a lot of stress. But I don't want to complain because everything worked out in the end. And the best part of my week has actually been attending a panel discussion with you,
so
Meghan, last night. So, and at this point, we can also share with Seren. So last night, we attended a panel discussion that was about the anthology called This Arab is Queer, hosted by Homotopia, which is an
so
arts
cool.
and social justice organization here in Liverpool. And so This Arab is Queer is written by three authors who happen to be Arab and queer and Palestinian. And they were talking about how they navigate shame and the feeling of not being Arab enough whilst not being queer enough. And notions of authenticity, and it resonated with me on such a deep level. I was telling Meghan, I'm getting so emotional because I really was. It was so good because it was so vulnerable and so honest, and they did not mind answering any questions. And the way I am, I took a lot of notes and I asked a question, and they were like, "That's a very deep question." I'm like, "I know, I'm so sorry. Take your time."
It was a great moment. I enjoyed it. I guess I should pick with your notebook and be like, "Okay, I have a question."
Yeah, because heads were turning. They're like, "What's this person doing with their notebook?" I'm like, "I know, I'm a nerd." And one thing that one of the authors said, and I quote, is he said, "My Islam was stolen from me." And it was so emotional because he was speaking about how he was robbed of a religion that at many points in his life was giving him comfort and peace. And that now has turned to him being depicted as an anomaly because of the media and the weaponization of religion, the weaponization of Islam, and having to justify your existence on a daily basis. And that made me feel so emotional because it was so vulnerable. And that was by far the best part of my week. And I wish anyone could have attended.
It was really good. It was definitely like
That sounds so cool.
a highlight of my week as well. I think it was, the conversation was really interesting. And the speaker that Ebru mentioned, I don't remember his name, but he, like lived in Jordan. He was 57. Like, it was like a perspective you don't like hear very often. And the openness of the panel, it was just, it was really interesting. I mean, the best part of this was a little bit before this week, but it was part of the Homotopia Festival as well. It was like the opening night, which was at the Tate, and there was a drag queen cabaret, and it was just such good vibes and like amazing performances. I think that was like one of the best things recently. So good old Homotopia. Like, I think it's an every year thing as well. And it was just a really like good experience, and it's nice to like get into Liverpool but outside of the uni as well. It's like it's not just like university focused, it's like the rest of the city exists and has like interesting people, which is fun. The worst part of my week, I think, is so Ebru's talking about scheduling issues. I feel like I've been the person creating scheduling issues for people. Like, I keep on like I've missed a few appointments, or I was just late and I would just turn up and just kind of forget about things. I think it's a symptom of being more busy with the PhD. I don't know. I think I have too many calendars or something. I don't know what's going on, because I'm quite a punctual person and like quite an organised person. So when
that's the impression you give. Is like
so when I don't do it, it's like this is out of character and I don't know what's happening. But I think it's just getting used.
I can't imagine you being late for anything.
It's just I don't turn up and I'm late, and I'm like, this is not acceptable. Not acceptable. Obviously, people can be late, but I'm not a late person usually.
Shh! Don't tell. Don't tell anyone.
No, I did everything perfectly. The PhD is perfect, and I'm a perfect student. But no, I think especially there was a moment where it was a Zoom meeting, and you know when Zoom sometimes opens your camera when you don't tell it to. And I was like literally just getting out of bed, and I looked like it was like dark in the room and stuff like that. And then I was
no,
it was like turn off the camera really quickly. It was it was very embarrassing. But I don't think anyone saw me. I hope anyway.
It probably made someone else's day on that.
Yeah.
So.
This person's joined late, and they obviously have just woken up, and it's not 9 a.m. It's like 10 or 11, and it's just like this is not right. But that was probably. Yeah, as someone who likes to be on time, it's like, oh, this is how the other half live. So is there anything like PhD related that's been going on that we should tell our listeners about, as this is a PhD podcast, I guess? Yeah, other than like just attending things. I have been going to the office, getting used to it. I'm going to go to an event in Manchester, and I'm excited about that because I like the idea of travelling.
Ooh, what event are you going to?
It's like there's an organisation called Code. It stands for something, but I'm not sure what. But I think it's like early career researchers who are like from minority backgrounds and stuff like that. And there's like an event in Manchester in December. So I'm like looking forward to trying to go to that. I think it'll be a fun experience. I want to do some in-person stuff. I think I like Zoom, but I like the free tea and the coffee and stuff.
Yeah, I feel like once I finish my fieldwork, I want to start going to more in-person things. So I think it will make me feel a bit more inspired and, a little bit more like, I don't know, part of something. Because sometimes it can feel a little bit isolating, even if you are going to an office and stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I started my data collection, which is exciting
massive
and
news.
a lot. Yeah, thanks. It's a lot of work, but I think many people who just like going into the second year starting data collection can like relate. It's a lot of work with like interviews but it's so exciting. I think that's my favorite part. But then again, I love writing as well, so it's hard.
But it's cool. It's like the big step. I feel like a lot of stuff leads up to it. I guess the whole PhD is structured around it. So it's like first year you prepare for your interviews, the last year you write up your interviews or your research. So it's well done. Good work.
Thank you.
It's also that sort of thing where, like, as you say, like the whole PhD is kind of structured around you doing this research, and it's almost like you prepare so much to do the research, you think, and then when you start doing it, it actually feels a bit like you don't feel prepared at all. Or I didn't anyway. I was suddenly just a bit like, I've been going to all these classes about doing research and like data collection and all these things, and now I've started, it's like, oh, actually it is something that I just have to make my own way through. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be fun to like hear more about your guys' research, and then I guess like, I'll start preparing more as well to do mine.
Yeah.
It'd be great. But yeah, I guess that's the end of our quick catch up. For our listeners, our structure of our podcast is going to be a little catch up for us, and then an interview with another PhD student, and then we'll come back for a debrief after. But Ebru is leading this episode, so I'll let you introduce your interview.
Woohoo! So now onto the interview where we discuss transitioning into a PhD, leaving the workplace, and the hopes and challenges associated with going back into academia. Hope you enjoy. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Bending Boundaries, where we challenge notions of the stereotypical PhD student and aim to encourage diversity representation and celebrate more diverse voices in academia. Today's guest of honor is Malika Ben Kahla, a teaching fellow and PhD candidate at the University of Liverpool, whose research explores the journey to equitable representation, particularly the experiences of women in academia. Prior to starting her PhD studies, Malika worked a decade in industry and directed her own consultancy business, which is amazing. With that being said, we wish you a very warm welcome to Bending Boundaries, Malika. So happy you found the time to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I actually wanted to start with an icebreaker.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, Malika, and we did this in our first episode as well, I'm going to ask you a would you rather question.
Okay.
Would you rather have a tattoo of the title of the last book you read or the last TV show you watched?
A tattoo?
Yes.
I haven't got any tattoos.
What did you watch last? Was it another murder mystery?
It was, yes. I'll admit, the last thing I watched was, I think it was Jeffrey Dahmer on Netflix.
Yes, you don't want to have that tattooed.
No,
Not today.
Absolutely not. But probably, if I did have a choice, it probably would be the last. If I did have to choose, it would be the last book I read. However, I probably wouldn't get a tattoo because I'm incredibly indecisive. So,
well, that's good to know. I always think people either have one or they have many. So, could you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and your fascinating research?
Yes. So, where should I begin? So, would you like me to start with my academic journey?
Yes. Anything where you want to start.
So I'll start off with, I guess, in school then. I really loved science. I was really into history, and the school I went to was in Liverpool, and not many people around me at the time had experience of further education. And so I thought, what can I do that's going to get me a job? And I started my academic journey in biomedical science, actually, so very different field. Although now I come to realise it's not so different from social science. So I did an undergraduate degree in biomedical science at Coventry and had a really enjoyable experience there.
Amazing.
Decided when I finished that actually working in a lab probably wasn't for me. So I did about 6 to 12 weeks, I think it was, working in a lab, doing some research on some bacteria. It was quite interesting, but
so you got into research quite early then.
I did, yeah. So I've always had a passion to discover things, and for me as a young person, it was always about trying to find out new treatments for things. That actually stems from my granddad. Had a really complicated condition that I got diagnosed with when I was about 8 years old, and I always wanted to find a new treatment for it, and that's what sparked my interest in research. And I guess as I went through my teenage years, I thought maybe this is something to make a career of. So yeah, that's I guess where my research interest started.
Amazing.
And then I finished my undergraduate degree. I went to work in industry. So I was working at a coffee shop while doing my studies. Also worked in bars and restaurants and all kinds of different places.
Kinds of jobs, yeah.
As you do when you're an undergraduate student and you need a bit of extra money. And yeah, I ended up managing a coffee shop, then doing a graduate scheme, and then doing a master's after I did my graduate scheme. And then PhD. So that's just a whistle-stop tour, I guess, of how I ended up doing those different things. None of it was particularly planned, apart from the science degree, which I very quickly learned that it wasn't actually for me. So I think I stopped planning things so meticulously after that point. So
amazing. And you're going into your third year now.
I am, yeah. So my master's was actually in human resource management, so it was very far from science, and it stemmed from actually being a human resource business partner, a HR business partner in industry, and wanting to get some more credibility because I had this degree in science, which was not anything to do with coffee in the coffee industry. And so I thought, maybe I should get an accreditation in this space, and a master's came up. I was really lucky that I say lucky because I had a really supportive manager, a HR director at the time, who she encouraged me to do not just a CIPD but actually go and do a master's, which is something interestingly that I had always intended on going back to university. I just wasn't sure when or what, and doing that was probably one of the best things that happened to me. I realised that dream that I had when I was 8 years old was, could be realised and could be a real thing. So,
Amazing. I think it is so important to have people that actually can show us that we can do something that we could have not, that we didn't think we could do.
Yeah.
Having those people that can encourage us, especially if we come from backgrounds where we don't necessarily have people that have the same academic knowledge that we may aspire to have someday.
So yes, you are right. I had very few people around me when I was growing up that had been through the university experience or even a role model. As a matter of fact, I did have a few people, and it was mainly teachers in my secondary school that had been through a university experience. However, their experience of university was limited to their educational qualification. Family and friends, there was really nobody that had been through that experience. So yeah, it was a challenge, I guess.
Yeah. I always think those pathways that are maybe that swayed away from the stereotypical pathway are very, very fascinating. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more. Before we dive into our next questions, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we met for the audience.
Yes.
So, Malika, you were the very first Liverpool local that I actually met when I moved to the UK last year. And you were assigned to me through our university's buddy scheme that is part of the PhD program at the management school. And we were paired up because I think in many ways our research has common denominators.
Yeah.
And I really have to say I could have not met a more kind person to give me the courage I needed that I can succeed in a country that is not my own and doing a PhD in a field that is not tied to my humanities and English literature background. So we met at a vegan cafe, and I think you had opened up to me how your topic changed throughout the first year of your PhD, and also how important cross-disciplinary expertise can be, and the opportunities that a different kind of background can actually open up for a PhD.
Yeah.
So with that being said, in light of your journey stepping into academia, what did that exactly look like? I mean, you already mentioned that you have a bachelor's in biomedical science, correct?
Yeah.
So, and how far did that actually help you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Firstly, thank you for mentioning how we met. And that's very kind of you to say. I will give that credit to being from Liverpool, actually, because I would say I know that we are bending boundaries, but a sweeping stereotype about people in Liverpool, if you don't already know, to listeners,
The Scouts.
Scousers are usually extremely friendly, and I take great pride in that, actually, so thank you. Yes, so could you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, so would you mind walking us through how you got to pursuing a PhD in business and management? Because
Yes.
I think it's so fascinating, because I think a lot of our listeners, myself included, our background is in something entirely different.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously I've talked about having a passion in research, which I think is very important if you do have an interest to do a PhD. But yeah, I can absolutely walk you through how I ended up going from biomedical science to business and management. So I think biomedical science, although when you read that and then you look at human resource management as a master's and then you look at a PhD in business and management, they probably appear on paper to be quite different things. And that drastic transition between biomedical science and into business, probably for a lot of people might appear as strange or
Unconventional.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's a really good word to use, actually. But actually, there are so many similarities that you can draw. So, science is, for me, it's all about discovery. And if you look back in history, I read about scientists over the different generations, and that there's something about the skills of a scientist, I think, and inventors across time that I can draw a real similarity to on a personal level. And the idea of making things better, I know that sounds really basic.
Transformation.
But yeah, that concept, I think it's always been part of my core personality, and my values about improving the way we live. And that could be through science in terms of how we treat people in a medical or a biomedical background versus how we treat people in the workplace. And so for me, that the transition wasn't easy. I'm going to be very honest. As you say, it's to move from biomedical science to management. However, there are some similarities that you can draw. So science, all about discovery, testing things, method is very important in science. However, and I come to realise this when I began the PhD, is that actually scientists in the biomedical space often are, thinking one way. They're often positivists.
Yeah.
And when you move into social science, the idea of being a positivist is kind of frowned upon by a lot of the social science world.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And it opened my eyes to the fact that actually there are lots of different ways of interpreting things, of seeing the world, and of seeing things which actually sung to me more than perhaps a biomedical lab environment did. And, in biomedical science, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, there was a lot of right and wrong. So you do a test like this, there is a right way to conduct things and there is a wrong way to conduct things.
And not to interrupt you, just as a frame of reference for our audience, a positivist basically looks at the world in black and white,
Yes.
as in the existence of one objective truth.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you. Yeah, so, and when you move into social science, you realise that there are actually lots of different ways of interpreting the world and seeing the world. And there are lots of different philosophical stances that you can employ to look at things. And so, yeah, I do see a lot of similarities between them two. However, a lot of people externally might not. And if anybody, I always say this to people, if anybody thinks that they've done one subject in undergraduate and then they might have messed up, perhaps. That's a phrase I often hear from people is, how can I move into a different discipline? But the reality is the skills that you learn in an undergraduate degree and a postgraduate degree, be it a master's or another, they are skills that are fairly transferable. And so you can always draw off what you have done and apply it in a different way. And that phrase, you can take lemons and make lemonade, I guess. I've always thought about that as in the experiences I've had and the skills that I've learned. So always taking what I have and being resourceful with those things. So just because I hadn't done an undergraduate in business and management, it didn't mean that I couldn't go and do that master's. And in turn, when I was making my PhD application, it was a real challenge not to let the fact that I hadn't done a business and management degree put me off that application potentially, because you know, there are so many people around you that are applying for PhDs, right? And they'll say, you know, well, I've got this experience, and it all seems on paper that their experience is always more credible than yours, perhaps. But yeah, I think whatever you've done, it's about being resourceful with what the experience you have got and trying to sell that in a way that puts you in the best light, and you know, to somebody who's making a decision about whether to recruit somebody on a PhD. My learning, I guess, is it was all a bit of a mystery when I applied, but I think the reality is it's not only, they don't only look at your CV and what you have done and what you haven't done. There's a lot more that goes into it, I think.
And I can imagine that, like, your 10 plus years in industry also shaped the way how you perceived the application process.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think I attacked the application. Attacked is probably the wrong word. I approached the application process as if I was applying for a job. Yeah. And so for me, it was about what experiences do I have. However, you know, I did feel that because I did have those years in industry, that might actually be a negative thing, perhaps, or a barrier to entry, because I hadn't spent so long in academia. I had gone off in industry and done a couple of years doing my own thing, and more than a couple of years. But yeah, I think in some ways the experience in industry presented me with lots of opportunity, but in other ways it did fill me with fear that maybe it was too late for me to apply for a PhD. Maybe I'd spent too much time in industry and didn't have the necessary criteria to fit in with what a PhD student would look like, you know.
Thank you so much for being so honest and vulnerable with that. It's actually something, the role of choice, challenges and fears, transitioning out of the workplace or the industry into academia. It's something I want to talk to you about today. And that's part of the main reason we invited you today on our podcast, because from an equality, diversity, and inclusion standpoint, we believe there is a lot of value in sharing your experiences with decision-making. Again, as I said, challenges, fears, and hopes that are very much a part of making the active choice to return to academia after having worked in industry for such a long time, particularly in exploring the ways your practical experience shaped your entire research journey. And of course, we always want to see who the person behind the research is. So with that being said, how are you finding your research and the PhD journey in general? Is it what you expected?
Great question, thank you. Absolutely not. So I began my PhD at a point in my life where, except for the second time in my life, I was at a crossroads. First time being when I finished my undergraduate degree and I couldn't get a job in, which I didn't mention earlier, I did actually apply for many jobs in science because even though I'd had that experience in a lab and I'd done that research and it wasn't quite for me, and I sort of had a feeling inside that maybe working in a lab all day and not communicating with anybody wasn't necessarily the best job choice for me, I still proceeded to apply for jobs in that space and realised about 6 months after applying for hundreds of jobs that maybe it wasn't going to work out, and had to make a real decision with my career. And for the second time in my life, I had to do that when I was applying for the PhD. And it was a huge decision, actually. And it was something that I probably for the first 12 months of starting my PhD had regular experiences of feeling like, what have I done? And what is this decision that I've made? This was a really bad decision. And some feelings of regret, but also I would not actually describe that as regret now. At the time I would have probably, and I probably did, as our conversations did happen in many different cafes over the first year we knew each other. There were times where I think I had shared with you feelings of regret, but now I reflect back on those now in my third year, and I think actually I'm not sure that was regret. I think it was more feeling I guess ambiguous about what was happening and unsure. And now I would say to people that it was probably one of the best decisions that I made, because whilst, yes, I did go through those feelings, on balance, I also feel like it's probably one of the best decisions I ever made. And I'm really glad I did it when I did it as well.
Yeah. I think a PhD is meant to make you feel uncomfortable. And I mean, we always tend to think of a PhD as a linear line, where you think of my first year, I'm going to start with my literature review. I'm going to go on to data collection.
Yeah.
I'm going to go on to analysis. And then there's the finished dissertation, and I'm going to pass. And oftentimes, there's so many emotional challenges that we do not expect to encounter. So again, thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of us are going to be able to relate.
Yeah.
And I always think it can be so anxiety-inducing, because I think of our research as a little bit of me search. So what is your personal connection to your research, and what attracted you to doing research on women in academia?
Yeah, so I became really interested with the idea of fair treatment at work when working as a HR business partner. And that experience of doing a master's really, something switched with me. So I went from wanting to learn more and the start of my master's, I wanted to learn as much as I could so I could be really credible in industry, and I could say, well, I've got a master's in HR, so I know what I'm talking about, which obviously is not really how it works, but in my head it did when I started my master's. And then as I was coming towards the end of my master's, I thought, well, actually this has gone from wanting to learn to wanting to explore, and part of exploring would be around research and recognising that there are so many gaps in what we do in academia, particularly the gap between, or the interplay between research and practice, which is something that I felt really strongly about, because I was sitting between industry and practice, because I was working full-time and studying part-time for my master's, and I was living that experience. And so I started to look at topics that I might be interested in exploring, and fair treatment at work was probably where I started. Then I realised it was really more like equity, because we talk a lot in industry about equality, but we don't talk as much about equity as I think we should.
So what's the difference? So
equality being, treat everybody the same, which is often what we talk about. The law tells us that we should pay, with gender pay in the UK, for example, since a couple of years back, the law changed and we all had to look at our gender pay in industry. Yeah. And since, experiences like that, plus experiences of, supporting people through tribunals and going to tribunals on behalf of companies myself, I realised that we were really striving for equality because that's what the law said, but really that was the bare minimum, whereas equity being about recognising that people don't always start at the same point, and therefore you can't treat everybody so-called the same. Actually, there's a lot more to it, and I think that's where a lot of organisations were falling down, that I was working in, experiencing myself. Personal experience as well, being from a mixed background, and personally experiencing inequity at work and outside of work. I felt really strongly about reading research and not seeing what I was seeing in practice reflected well enough in research. So a lot of research about equality, diversity, inclusion, respect, which is now termed EDIR. A lot of it was really about a certain demographic, and I was reading it again and again, and I was sort of becoming increasingly frustrated with that. And so that really is a personal passion. And as you mentioned earlier, I started my PhD wanting to look at these things but not really having a firm grasp on what that was. So I remember writing a proposal, and I'm probably going to share this, and I'm sure a lot of people in the management school might listen to this and think, really? She wrote that in a couple of weeks? But yes, I was a very last minute applicant is probably the best way to describe it. I churned out this 2,000 word proposal about what I was going to do, and I remember meeting my supervisors and thinking, gosh, this is really not what I want to do at all, and having to be really honest from day one that I wrote that proposal because I was so desperate to do a PhD, but I hadn't really, which I don't think many people do, right? So I think a lot of people say, I want to do a PhD, and they don't really firm up what it is they want to look at until they actually get there. And probably spent the first 3 months of my experience searching about around them topics and thinking about what it is I wanted to do. And yeah, my topic actually changed 2 times in my first year, which was a lot to, you know, take on, but we got there in the end. And the story goes like this, really, is that I had the passion of looking at equity, but then the more I started to explore equity in different workplaces, the more I came across literature about universities and the academy, and I was thinking, well, I'm studying in a university, you know, I'm studying towards a PhD. If we still have a problem with equity in universities, how can I move beyond the walls of a university, so to speak, metaphorically, because obviously. And so I thought about potentially looking at universities. And the more I explored it, the more I thought, well, universities is where we create, disseminate and generate knowledge. And so how can I look at another group or another context when there's still so much work to be done here? And that's why I settled on my topic. So it's a real like personal passion of mine.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. You have mentioned so many aspects, like that it's so important not to confuse equality with equity. And I think a lot of us, just because we can't know everything, right? So thank you so much for clarifying that. But also you saying that we don't always start off with the same resources.
Yes.
For a lot of us, it is a lot harder to access education, in higher education institutions that have a certain reputation. And I think we tend to forget that, yes, there is a certain degree to truth when it comes to meritocracy, basically working your way up through hard work. At the same time, though, we cannot forget the realities of we do not start off with the same resources. And oftentimes it's because of our intersectional identities. It is because we do not have the same social and human capital to start off with, especially when some of our parents happen to have an economic labor migrant background. But thank you so much for sharing that. And speaking about your journey and how you came to where you are today, what have you found striking or surprising so far along the journey?
So I think for me, it's been a huge learning experience coming out of industry and going into academia. The pace of how we work is so different. And when I was working in industry, the aim was to produce as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And it didn't really matter about depth. What mattered is that, as a business partner in particular, it mattered that you were covering breadth of what your job was, and that you were delivering all of the productivity measures, if you like, but not necessarily it with depth, so to speak. Whereas academia is really about depth. And you can spend, months on a word or on a topic, as you well know.
Sleepless nights.
Yes, 11 hours reading.
10 coffees later.
Yes, exactly. And 46 drafts or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that transition, I hadn't quite anticipated how much it would impact me. I had to really put my foot on the brakes and just completely change my, you talk about being a situational leader in management, you talk about being agile is the big word, it was when I was working in industry. But this was a test in completely different ways. I had to completely reinvent how I approached my work, being okay with ambiguity, and not just being okay with it, actually being able to navigate through it as well. I think there's a sense of competition between peers. And the reality is we're competing with ourselves to get over the line with our PhD. Yet there is a sense of competition wherever you go. And when you are studying something such as a PhD, it's a passion project. So I think you use me-search, yes, which I really love that term, actually. You should coin that and use it somewhere. But yes, so it's a passion project, I call it. And you've just heard how closely, connected I am with my story and my research. But actually, when somebody criticises that, especially when you're in the middle of, potentially trying to develop something.
Or presenting at a conference.
Exactly, yeah. And I'll be honest, the experiences I've had generally are very kind experiences, which did surprise me because I, having read the literature, had expected the experience to be a lot more cutthroat. Can I use that word?
Yeah.
As you know, a lot more critical than it actually was. That doesn't mean that won't happen to me. I think I've just chosen some very kind environments to be in. But yeah, I think that they're probably the pace and having to be super vulnerable and put yourself in a position where, you know, something that's half finished, an idea that you're developing, which you've crafted over, you know, lots of sleepless nights or, you know, lots of hours of reading and thinking, can then very quickly be squashed almost. And that's been a real challenge. The amount of change that happens in a PhD as well. So because it is so consuming, it's a passion project, you often find that you it does consume your life, and you've still got to have a life. So, you know, it's finding that balance, I think, between my husband would especially have described me as a workaholic pre-PhD because I used to work a lot and I used to work many hours in a week. I used to be travelling all the time. And then I start the PhD and it's a completely different type of work. And whilst I don't think he would use the term workaholic anymore, he uses lots of other words to describe me. But friends as well would say that now I'm a very different personality. I'm still me, but I'm a lot more relaxed. But I'm also always thinking about my research, and that's something that you can't. When I used to work in industry, although I'd work a lot, when I was off work, be it on a day off or on a holiday, I was completely switched off. In the PhD, I don't think it's as easy to do that, and I think that's a skill that I'm not sure I'll ever learn, but I will try, and I continue to try to find a balance. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I agree. I think a PhD is a total reinvention and a lot of growth when it comes to your personal self.
Yeah.
But also it's about getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I think that doesn't have a start and off button. I think it's a continuous journey. And the same with trying to sometimes detach yourself from your project.
Yeah.
Because the critique you get, it's not directed at yourself, but detaching yourself from a passion project, it is difficult.
Yeah.
But again, very fascinating, everything you have to say. And at this point, I think we should take a quick break. And when we come back, we will talk about the role of choice, hopes, and challenges in transitioning out of the workplace and returning to the world of academia and what we can learn from that. Welcome back, beautiful people, to Bending Boundaries. I hope everyone had a nice little break. I hope, Malika, you had a nice little break.
Okay, thank you.
Your extensive experience working industry and then transitioning to the PhD made me think of some keywords that I had mentioned earlier, namely social and educational mobility, and the challenges behind that. So I'm saying this because many people listening to this podcast, us both included, come from working class conditions and may be children of economic labor migrants and happen to be first generation graduates.
Yeah.
Meaning many of our parents, for various reasons, did not have the opportunity or the privilege to graduate high school. In fact, research demonstrates there is a strong link between your parents' educational level and your own educational outcomes. But in fact, many of us do graduate high school and make what I call an intergenerational breakthrough when it comes to educational upwards mobility. So with that background, what role do you think did certain resources that you had, or the lack thereof, play in your mobility? And how did you take ownership of your career, starting up your own consultancy business in your early mid-20s?
Yeah.
Which is amazing. And all of that whilst completing your master's.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. Some people would say...
I say it's amazing and inspiring.
Yeah, thank you. Some people would say quite the opposite. But yeah. So in terms of my background, I grew up in quite a working class environment. I'm one of 5. So there was lots of us. I'm the oldest of 5 as well. Lots of us growing up. In fact, there's actually a 17-year gap between myself and my youngest brother. So you can imagine what our household dynamics were growing up.
Yeah, I mean, my younger sibling and I, we have 9 years of an age gap. So I already thought then I am taking on a parental role, which I can't even imagine in your case.
17 is when people. I always tell the story when my brother was very young. Me and my mum went to the shop one day and somebody confused my brother to be my child, and my mum and me had to correct them. And that was a moment, I think, where I realised that, because for me it was completely normal. It was all I'd ever known. But growing up in a place, I grew up in a place near Aintree in Liverpool called Maghull, which is, not too diverse. It's probably the best way to describe Maghull, especially when I was growing up. Yeah. It has quite an ageing population, and it's a small town, actually, in the very much the outskirts of Liverpool. There's nothing. I mean, I wouldn't recommend a day trip there because there isn't really much to see. No, but there are lots of other places in Liverpool you could go and see that are way more interesting. No offence to anyone from Maghull who listens to this, but grew up there. I mean, my dad was. He's North African, so he's Tunisian. He grew up, he's one of 10, and he grew up travelling around Tunisia as his father was a policeman, and he did keep getting moved around for various reasons, which I won't go into for this podcast. But and then my dad's mother, my grandmother was, obviously having 10 children, she was really a stay-at-home mum. And so my dad met my mum on a holiday, which sounds really cheesy. I recognise that, but genuinely it is how they met.
Same with my parents.
Really? Yeah, okay. So it's not as uncommon as I think, but they met on holiday. It's a holiday romance. They got married after a certain amount of time knowing each other, and they were together for 32 years. So my mum's family are Irish immigrants, and they arrived in Liverpool. I'm not sure which generation it was, to be honest with you, but I know that the history of both surnames fall back to that kind of part of the world. So my mum grew up in Liverpool. She was Catholic. My dad was Muslim. So you can imagine, again, especially in the 80s when they got married, that was a real challenge for both families, I think.
That was the gossip.
It really was, and so, my dad moved over to this country in the mid-80s, I think, late 80s. Don't quote me on dates and times because I'm really bad at that. But so my dad moved to the UK, and my grandfather, my mum's father, found him some work in a company called Otis, and they make lifts. I don't know if they still make lifts, but if you ever go into a shopping centre or you go in a lift, sometimes they have the Otis logo, and that's a company that he worked for in Liverpool. My dad actually spoke 5 languages. He was working in a hotel when he met my mum, so learning languages was part of, I guess it was a necessity. However, my dad didn't really have many qualifications. He did this exam called the baccalaureate exam, and I think he had to sit it a number of times. He would never really share how many times or whether he actually did pass, but his educational background, although he was a very intelligent man in a lot of ways, his educational credentials were not really there.
I think that's the thing, like a lot of people would have had so much potential to graduate with a really good degree, but back then, due to several challenges, one of those, I think, the rampant racism running through the early 80s, and not that it has gotten much better. I think there's a difference between overt racism and just covert racism. But I think that's just one aspect of why many individuals, especially economic labor migrants, might have not had the privilege to attain credentials.
Absolutely. That definitely the case. My mum, she finished school and she worked really hard. My mum, she had 3 jobs, so she was never had a quiet day. She was always really busy, but she also didn't go to college. She finished her, I think, I can't remember what GCSEs used to be called before they were GCSEs, but they used to have a term for them. And she did those, and then I don't know if they were called GCs or something. But anyway, my mum finished high school and then she got a job, or several jobs, worked for a while. And then they started a family after they'd been together for a few years. But yeah, times were quite tough. They faced a lot of racism from friends, or so-called friends, from family as well. And they actually, obviously I wasn't born at the time, but now I talked to my mum about her past experience, and I realised how much adversity and challenge that they faced together, to kind of do the things that they wanted to do and they had to do. And so after a few years they had me, followed by several brothers and sisters. Yeah, many siblings, 4. But yeah, so that was how I grew up, really. We were very lucky. In fact, whilst I do recognise that there were some challenges and I had a lot of barriers growing up, I also recognise that I was very lucky. I have many cousins. Obviously, my dad's one of 10. And so you can imagine if all of those aunties and uncles that I have all got several children. I don't think there isn't one that doesn't have children. The number of cousins I have, I actually don't know all their names, which is really embarrassing to admit, but it's true. I know the ones that are around my age and a little bit older, a little bit younger, but as time went on, it becomes very difficult to keep track when you've got such a large family.
I think it's very typical for North African
yes,
and Middle Eastern families. Like, I have so many 30s and 40s of cousins.
Yes.
But I'm so sorry if any one of them is listening. Just putting the love out there.
Yes.
It's a lot.
However, it was great because I do count myself very lucky in that I got the privilege of growing up with 2 cultures and experiencing, that even though we were very working class, is how I describe it, right? Without going into too much detail, we struggled when we were growing up. Even though we had that, we still managed to go to Tunisia pretty much every year. We went for the whole summer holidays. My dad would take time off work, and as a family, we had the summer with our family, And it's always funny because I say to people, it was never really a holiday; it was more visiting family, and it's a joke. But actually, I was very privileged that I got that experience growing up, because how many people do you know? Or how many people do I know who have had that luxury of that experience? I don't know many people. So I do think there are challenges to that, but I also think there are lots of benefits to that. You become somebody who's way more aware of your peers from a younger age. You're able to understand, and I grew up with the knowledge that there are different people from different places who have different cultural norms, and take the time to understand that, whereas a lot of my peers at a younger age possibly didn't quite have that sort of awareness. So
So it took you a lot of not only hard work, but also facing adversity in terms of coming from a mixed racial background. And I think oftentimes, I am not mixed. I'm just what I consider a fully woman of color. But, and I face adversity ranging from microaggressions to overt acts of exclusion on a almost daily basis. But then I think there's unique challenges as a mixed person. And still, you worked so hard and you made it to the point where you started up your own consultancy business. So it took so much, and then you made the active choice to come back into academia. What inspired you to do this?
Yeah, I think so. Growing up, I did face a lot of barriers and challenges, and I guess we've all faced these sort of subtle comments, and I still face them today, to be honest with you. And my parents always taught me that having an education was the most important thing, even though it wasn't something they had practiced themselves. It was something that was ingrained into me from a young age. And my grandparents, like my grandfather before he got sick, was like, there was always this notion of, you're a woman, so it's going to be harder for you. So you gotta work harder if you want the things. And so I guess that is something that was, from a very young age, something I was very aware of. So that drive and tenacity was there, I think, you know, if somebody said to me, and I remember this really well, I'll tell you the story before I talk about how I go into consultancy, is I always remember being told, you know, oh, you might not get to university.
Yeah.
Or you'd be lucky.
I can.
Yeah, in secondary
100%
school.
relate. Yeah.
I went to secondary school. I always worked really hard. Wasn't the brightest kid in the class, I'm going to be honest, for lots of reasons. But I wasn't. I probably wasn't the kid in the class that they'd look at and you'd go, oh yeah, she's going to go on to a PhD. Never in my wildest dreams. Even the thought of doing a degree when I was in my teenage years, that was like...
So far.
Yeah. And I remember results day when I was 18. It's one of the days I do remember. And I remember getting that envelope and thinking, gosh, if I've made this... I'd actually made plans over the summer to do something completely different because I was convinced I wasn't getting into university. That is how much it had sort of affected me. But I remember somebody saying to me that you'll be lucky if you make it. And I wanted to prove them wrong. And I was like, no, I will make it and I will do it. Of course, there was a lot of anxiety in the background, and I don't think I've ever let that person see that. They're not in my life anymore, but yeah, I always wanted to kind of, if somebody told me I couldn't do something, then that was actually the fuel for me to go and do something, and do it really well as well. So that was from 18, and as I went through my career, I did face, particularly in the workplace, actually, I remember applying for jobs when I was 21, and my surname became a real barrier. And I noticed it because I did a little experiment, which is probably, I'm going to admit this now, and I probably, like, if I was doing it in research terms, I'd have to do like a full ethics application, and it wouldn't be classed as overt research, it'd be definitely classed as covert. But I remember applying for jobs with a different surname just to see, and I did. I got callbacks with a different first name and surname, because my name, when you read my name and then you meet me, they don't match. From what society deems as, you know, you read my name and you think, firstly, I get misgendered all the time because of my surname. It's Ben Kahla, and or it's actually in Arabic it's Ben Kahla, and so they read the Ben and they think, right, Mr. Ben Kahla, it must be. And then they meet me and I'm Scouse, and I do look, if you looked at me in the street, you might not believe I was half Arab, but I am. And then you hear my accent, and I'm a bit of an enigma, I'm going to be honest. And so even in the workplace, I worked a lot with people in the south of the country. And what I didn't realise is actually it's not just about being from a mixed background and having, you know, dual heritage and, you know, and being from a working class family. That wasn't enough. You know, that was enough to be a barrier. But actually being from the north and having a Scouse accent and not going to one of these elite schools. And I'll tell you a funny story in a bit about the first day I arrived at Liverpool, actually. But all of this actually became an issue day in, day out. So not only did they get my name wrong, but they would then interpret my accent to be somebody who wasn't educated, somebody who there's a bit of a stereotype in Liverpool about people maybe being dishonest or stealing things, and I would get that actually in the workplace.
Being criminalised.
Yeah, absolutely, just because of my accent. How I would pronounce certain words used to get laughed at in big meetings. And so all of these things, they just fueled me with a fire to prove people wrong. And that was what kept me going in industry. And the darkest moments of, you know, I experienced bullying in the workplace, I experienced completely unfair treatment, people making decisions about my pay that wasn't fair and wasn't just in comparison with others, being on a graduate scheme that was, you know, a challenge. It was a fairly new graduate scheme, so there were lots of learnings, lots of positives came out of that, but also lots of challenges. And so I'd faced all of these things, and every time something was, you know, something happened, an experience happened, every time I felt like something was unjust towards me, that just fueled me 10 times over to come back and fight it. And so when I got made redundant, which was a real blow to me because that I did not see that coming at all, when I got made redundant and the opportunity came to present, the opportunity arose to set up a business. Yes, in my mid-20s. I do admit that was very early to set up a consultancy business in HR, but I did it because I was following what the market was telling me. And I really remember people that I had respected and inspired me and had been mentors said to me, what are you doing? are you sure this is what you want to do? And I remember thinking, oh, maybe this is a bit too much. Maybe I've bitten a little bit off more than I can chew. But I did it, and I did it well. And it served its purpose for what I needed it to do at the time. And, you know, was I going to be a millionaire after setting up my own business? No, but that was never my intention. My intention was to get through the pandemic and to hopefully get a PhD. And the consultancy stuff was just while I was kind of, you know, trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do after being made redundant. So, yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question fully, but...
Yeah, I mean, you know, the question related to having limited resources.
Yeah.
Coming from lower working class conditions. And in your case, coming from Liverpool, where a lot of people, I think, from other parts of the UK attach a certain stereotypical image to it, demonize certain... individuals that come from Liverpool and have the Scouse accent maybe. And so you just mentioned so many emotional and practical challenges that you faced and that you took as grounds of inspiration to really fuel you to do something that scared you, but you still did it, something that made you feel uncomfortable. But I think also there is never a right time.
No,
whether when it comes to things like starting up your own business or even family planning, and then also going into a PhD. So I would almost say you had moments where you maybe faced in your life some more financial security because you had a job in industry. And then, and I'm not saying that starting up your own business promises a lot of good money. That's not my point. But I'm saying you then transitioned back into academia.
Yes.
Why? I think that's a question that many of us are curious about.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And yeah, when you mentioned about resources, which I'll just touch on first, and I think the resources, I always tried to recognise that this is what I do have rather than this is what I don't have. Does that make sense? So here's what I do have, what can I do with what I have? And it's about being resourceful rather than highlighting what resources I don't have versus what I do. Because if I thought about all the things that I don't have all the time, I would probably never do anything.
Yeah, I think you compare it to looking at the glass as either half full or half empty. Yeah, exactly. So I always try to look at, never mind if it's halfway there, just what is there? Is there something in there? if there is something in there, then I can do something with it. And that, I guess, is my mantra, and that's how I approach life. The PhD, I remember going to an open day in university, and I must give credit to University of Liverpool, actually, because my master's experience, and remember I told you that I'd have a story later on, this is it. I got to day one of University of Liverpool. I remember getting my offer letter through and thinking, how the hell have I managed to secure an offer at a red brick university? I was told when I was younger I would never even be able to walk in one. And we still made it.
And we made it, yeah. And I remember coming on the first day, walking past the Philharmonic, which is where lots of us graduate. And I remember thinking, oh, that'll be me in a few years' time. And that was what I held on to while I was really struggling with managing both. And I remember getting here and thinking, oh gosh, I'm not really supposed to be here. I've really got to step my game up because I'm not like these other people in the room. It's really silly now, I laugh about it, because the truth is lots of people going on their first day and feel a real sense of dread and lost, and they don't know where they're going, and they don't know what the expectations are.
Out of space.
Yes. Yeah. And I remember sitting through the first lecture and walking out of the lecture and thinking, I've got to do this for 2 years now. And because it was a 2-year part-time programme. And I thought, there's too much resting on this. And all I wanted to do was run away. I'll be really honest. So there have been lots of times where I thought, maybe this is not for me. Maybe I should have just quit while I was ahead, you know, because this could make or break me, really, because I was working ridiculous hours and I'd committed to this master's, which it was also a big commitment. Even at part-time, there was a lot of work to do. And so why I said I've got to give credit to University of Liverpool is because throughout my 2 years, I wouldn't have got through my master's if it wasn't for some of the staff at the university. And, you know, some of the module leaders I worked with were incredibly supportive, and celebrated my work experience, which I never thought would be celebrated. I thought it was doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that I've, you know, got nearly 10 years of experience in industry. That didn't matter. What matters was that I had always very much separated them, and they inspired me that you can bring those things together. It was a very immersive course. We had lots of guest speakers, and I related to them a lot. Again, always very studious, always the one to put a hand up and ask a question, which I think did help me at that time, but also was producing really good work as well, was listening to feedback. I'd be that student who'd, you know, contact the module leader and thank them, but also ask for help if I needed it, which really put me outside of my comfort zone, because I don't really like to ask for help, to be honest with you. It's not a great skill of mine. Although I'm learning it. Yeah, I'm learning when to say, actually, this is too much, I need help. And so I met a couple of people from careers along my 2 years. I remember going to some careers talks, and I remember talking to some advisors, and, you know, a couple of situations where they'd say, there isn't really much we can do for you. I had that quite a lot, because I had this industry experience. I wasn't going into an entry-level graduate job. I was already an industry professional, and there didn't seem to be a space for me. So
it's almost like being overqualified for certain things, and still whilst being underqualified for other things.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a real, you know, paradoxical situation. You sort of, and it is a bit of an out-of-body experience, because you think, well, where can I go? You know, where do you go if you can't get help there? Then where else can you get help? You know,
this feeling of belonging.
Exactly.
Where do I belong?
Exactly. And I grappled with that. And I remember when I got made redundant, and, you know, I was in the midst of doing a bit of consulting, and it set up my business, and things were going okay, but I thought, this is not the end. And I remember when I finished in HR thinking, I've got to do more than this. A couple of months early, I'd had a lot go on in my family. Personally, I'll share, you know, my dad had passed away in the November. I had a really bad car crash in the December, and then, you know, so I had a lot going on. And I remember, my memory is a bit patchy for that period of time in my life anyway, but I remember going to a PhD talk and hearing somebody from another university, I think he was from Birmingham, and he spoke about a PhD experience, completely different subject. Yeah. And I remember sitting there and thinking, okay, so I've done the undergraduate, I've done that, and I got there. I'm getting the masters, and I'm doing really well here. Shocking myself every time I submitted a paper. It was a traumatic experience, but then I'd get the mark and I'd go, oh, you know, I can't do this.
Why did I spiral for 24 hours? Swimming, crying, hysterically laughing?
Yeah, that hasn't really gone away, I'm going to be honest. But, you know, I go through that, and then I hear this person speak, and I thought, can I do this now? Can I do a PhD? Am I going to do this? And I remember sitting in a coffee shop near campus that I frequent, and we've been there many a time. And I remember, I was actually my husband I was speaking to, and I said, you know, what do you think about me doing a PhD? And he's extremely supportive. He was like, you know, do what you want, whatever makes you happy. Yeah. And he really, like, he celebrates the fact that I'm, you know, super into learning, and in fact have inspired him to do I will take the credit for inspiring him to do a qualification, and that sort of went away because all the family stuff went on, and I was trying to finish my masters, and, you know, trying to work through a lot of things, and then I remember the call-in came out, and Sadie Lawty in Careers, she sent me a little note, and we caught up, and she said, have you thought about applying for this PhD? There's funding available. And this must have been, I think the deadline was in April, at the end of April, and it was like early April, so there was like 3 weeks or something to like turn this application around. And I remember thinking, like, am I actually going to do this? Like, am I going to go for this? We were in lockdown, and I thought, well, apart from that assignment that I've got to get in at the end of the month, I've got nothing better to do. So, and work had gone a bit quiet, and I thought, well, I might as well.
What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, exactly. Worst thing, they can say no. And if they say no, then maybe I'll have learned about the application process. Because remember, I did go to that talk a couple of months ago, and I did have a conversation, and it's always been the thought as it, you know, if I think back to 8-year-old me, who very boldly asked a doctor when we were going to one of my granddad's appointments, you know, what does a doctor do? And I thought about that in this really like sort of weird period of being in lockdown and going out the house for an hour a day and to walk the dog or whatever. And I thought, like, God, 8-year-old me would never have dreamed that, you know, now I'd be applying for this. And I had so many things go through my mind, but I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do it. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
And so I did. And so that is how, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, that is how I ended up. I think by the time I'd sort of set up my business, I'd realised that being a HR business partner was not going to fulfil me forever.
Yeah.
Because I just had this passion to do something else, and this was the something else. So.
Thank you for sharing that and for being so vulnerable with your personal challenges along the way. And one thing I want to say is that when things get hard, I want us to remember that 8-year-old Ebru and Malika would be so damn proud.
Yes.
And especially because what you're basically saying is sometimes it takes 1 or 2 or 3 or just one individual to really believe in you.
Yeah.
And to tell you, you can do this.
Yeah.
And for that to give you the courage to try something out that you don't feel ready for.
Yeah.
And I had 3 people in my life doing that for me because I never thought I would be doing a PhD. In fact, I was told during my master's that a professor could not give me a recommendation letter because they did not believe that I was good enough for a PhD.
Wow.
Well, here I am going into my 2nd year having a chat with you about this, and it feels really, really good. And yes, I won't be a medical doctor, as my dad always expected me to be, but I will be some kind of doctor.
Yeah.
So, and I think there are so many rewarding things about making that scary choice, transitioning from industry, from something that you have grown comfortable with.
Yeah.
Stepping out of that, going back into academia.
Yeah.
What is the most rewarding aspect of making the choice to step back into academia, do a part-time master's, and then stepping into a PhD?
So I think, funnily enough, you say what's the most rewarding? Was it the rewarding choice?
Rewarding, yeah.
It is choice. Yeah. So I think that for me, the most rewarding aspect of doing this and doing this journey is that I've had the privilege and the honour to choose what I want to do, what makes me happy, the gift, and this is going to sound really cheesy, so, you know, listeners, you know, I know this, I sound like a real geek right now, but...
if you're doing a PhD, are you really, can you say you're not a geek?
Yeah, you pretty much, that comes with the job description, doesn't it? But, you know, I think it's a gift to be able to research about a topic that you're passionate about, that you're interested in, and you can contribute to. That, for me, is like the dream, you know? I really don't care about... Obviously, I need enough money to live, but, you know, all those things that you care about, I think, or I cared about when I was younger, about, you know, I want a really good job and I want to be successful and I want to break the generational kind of barrier and I want to, you know, move to a position where I don't worry about money anymore. All of those, like, dreams and aspirations of where I realise now, like, we're fueled by, like, lots of things that society was telling me.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, the gift to be able to do a PhD and do research about something that interests you, I think that has been the most rewarding thing, because how many people can say that they do that? Not many.
And how many people can speak about the privilege of making a choice when it comes to directing your work.
Exactly.
I mean, you are the one who has power over that. You are in control, and I think that in itself is a privilege. So thank you so much for sharing that. And to round up our interview today, how do you hope your research will bend boundaries?
So thank you for that question. So I hope that my research will bend boundaries in several ways. So I hope that I'll be able to contribute theoretically and be able to use a different perspective to help to explain inequity. But I also hope that there's a practical solution as well. So it goes back to the interplay between academia and practice, in that I hope that it will bend boundaries and that it will actually tangibly impact as well and change the way we think about things. will I be able to break down, hundreds of years of systems and processes and inequity? No, that my research is not going to do all of that. But even if it contributes in a small way, I think that's how I'm bending boundaries.
Thank you so much. And with that being said, thank you so much for everyone taking your time listening to us. Thank you, Malika, for sharing your personal and practical experiences, for being so honest and vulnerable with us. And we are looking forward to seeing you on next month's episode. And now let's get back to Seren and Meghan for a debrief.
So, guys, what struck you about this interview with Malika? Maybe Meghan?
Okay, so I really liked Malika's interview. I thought it was really interesting. One thing that struck me was listening to Malika's experience of going from work like industry. Academia always has different words for stuff. So industry is work, I guess.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, it's like I think it is like, going back and forth. And anyway, but yeah, so Malika talked about the different types of work that you do. So in industry or work, it's a lot of kind of outputs and not like superficial work, but a lot of like tasks and completing and that sort of thing. And I think, and then in academia, it's more deep work. So you can spend a long time like looking at just one concept, or you can be really thinking about your word choices, considering, I think when you're doing like interviews and stuff, you're considering like your positionality. So like who you are when you're doing the research, like I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm a Black person from London, and I'm going to be interviewing those kinds of people. You're thinking about how that impacts your work, and that's just not something you really do in normal work, especially when I was working as a researcher. It wasn't, that sort of stuff wasn't considered. It was more about, I don't know, getting outputs and kind of proving the outputs. So yeah, that really struck me, the different types of work that you might do while you're and adjusting to that as well when you move into doing the PhD.
And when you were working in that job that was like almost like, I don't know what the word is, but like, just a normal job, but being a researcher, like when it comes to ethics and stuff, like in academia, we spend a lot of time talking about our ethical approach and thinking about like different scenarios, and if they are, what we would do in that circumstance to be as ethical as possible. Like, how does that work in terms of, I don't know, it's not like commercial research, but like research that isn't academia? Is it the same, or is it like more bureaucratic? Like, is it just like there's a checklist of things that we need to do?
Yeah, I can't even remember doing any ethics stuff. So that maybe tells you something. But it is like, you would have consent forms as normal. But a lot of the research that I did was workplace research. So it was about like employee engagement. So I'd be interviewing employees in their workplace, and it did feel like, and I don't know if it's like this everywhere, but it felt like we got the consent from the organization, and that was the biggest thing. And then also you would check with the organization what you wrote as well to make sure that they were like happy with it. So it was like a very different dynamic. It's more, I guess, slightly less control. And also for the employees, I definitely had this more than once. They gave me fake names, and they didn't really trust me because I was like, my position was coming in as part of their workplace stuff. So yeah, it's like, I don't remember doing any ethical things except for like consent forms and then getting approval from the organization afterwards. It's kind of like, once I did the interviews, it was like I didn't talk to the participants again. It's very different process.
Yeah, but you're right about that kind of like deep thinking. And I know that, when I've previously had jobs that were outside of academia, like in some ways there's like more work to do, but it's almost like it's a different kind of work that I feel like often, as you say, like requires less like deep interrogation of what you're doing. Like probably not all the time, but in the work that I was doing, just like a kind of classic sort of office job and stuff. And I actually find deep thinking really, really hard. And I find that part of academia like it kind of is the whole of academia. But I find that really difficult, like just having to sit with discomfort and sit with not knowing and sit with like just thinking about things sometimes for a really long time before you take any action.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes I know in the past I've been like, oh, why do not why do we have to think about it so much? But sometimes it's like it's not that deep. But then there is value in thinking about things deeply as well. So it's like sometimes I do I have to write 1,000 words about my positionality? I'm like, sometimes I don't think it's worth it. But then it's like it is actually quite a valuable part of the research as well. So it is confusing.
How about you, Ebru? What was your kind of biggest takeaway from Malika's interview?
I think there were so many valuable things that were said, especially when people make that decision to like transition back into, education, especially into when it's a PhD, because there's so many dynamics involved in a PhD. And I think one thing that we were discussing was about like feeling like terror and feeling so frightened and so vulnerable when you are in the midst of writing your proposal and you realize that, or you have that striking thought, you're like, I don't know what I'm actually writing about. I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know what I'm doing here. Should I really be doing this? Am I qualified enough? Do I have enough skills to conduct research to do a PhD? And I think oftentimes it's so easy to get like to drown in these very, very like strong and valid but also toxic thoughts, because we always think about what we don't have, the skills that we don't have, the things we are not equipped with, especially if we maybe happen to come from a background where, you know, we don't necessarily have like parents who have degrees or went really to universities. And something Malika said was that at some point she just made that decision where she said, okay, what do I have? Is there something? And if there is something, I'm going to take that and I'm going to build something else from that. And that was when I like brought in the like analogy of you can look at the glass of water as half full or half empty. So, and with that, I think there's a certain vulnerability to that, but it's also growth when you come to that conclusion, when you're like, I'm just going to write this proposal and I'm going to send it off because I will have given it my best. And if it works out, it works out. And if not, try again, right? Especially if you really, really have passion for it and if you really want it. But I think the biggest injustice we can do to ourselves is like by sabotaging ourselves and just not taking that leap of faith. Because that's with many things in life. And also, I feel like there's always going to be a way. There always is. And doing a PhD is such a privilege. So that really stuck with me.
And kind of, sorry, just, what you were saying, I think I definitely had that because I never got a first in any of my degrees, even though I have so many. I have like 3 now, and it's like I've never got a first. I remember like when I was applying for the PhDs, people were like, if you don't have a first, you're not going to get funding, basically. That was like something people... And in one of the universities I applied for, they literally said, they don't even take you through the first round. And so the university didn't even send your application off to the DCP, who ended up funding me. But like, it's just like, they didn't do that because they were like, this person might not get it. And I remember that being, when I was waiting to hear back about funding, I was like, oh, I probably won't get it because I didn't have a first and all this stuff. But then, like you said, I have other stuff, you know, my work experience, my life, my abilities and all this stuff. But I definitely I wrote myself off. I did the applications, but I was like, well, maybe not. This isn't going to happen. And I did get offered funding from 2 places. So, you know, you can, like, it's kind of, in hindsight, I'm like, wow, those people, the other people that didn't put me through, it was a similar application. I might have got it from there as well, but they didn't. Yeah. So question yourself.
Yeah, and I think just real quick to that, like that's something I said in the interview. Like sometimes it just takes that one person that believes in you and that allows you to like believe in yourself. Like you don't have to have a whole squad behind you cheering you on. I think having that one person is enough.
Yeah, it does definitely take just having like one person believe in you for it to kind of make so much difference. And I also was thinking about this when I heard Malika talk about how I think she said that she was encouraged by like a careers worker at her uni to apply for a PhD. And I was thinking about like how for me as well, like personally, like the experience, like the role of like other academics in encouraging people to apply is really, really important. And, you know, like I don't think I ever would have applied if it hadn't been for the person who supervised me for my undergrad, like helping me apply, because it's such like an exclusive process as well. Like applying for a PhD is like really, really like hard to understand, because I remember when I first heard about it being so confused, because it was like you have to apply to a university, but then you also have to, if you want funding, you also have to apply to like a funding body, and sometimes those applications are connected and sometimes they're not, and like it just like so much like red tape and like so much like really difficult information to understand, and like I think it's really, really stressful. And I think that's academics, I hope that like most academics, if they're good academics, are like aware of like how important that role is in like encouraging people who especially might not have like other academics in their lives or anything to apply, and to show them that their ideas are like worth something. But I don't know, I think it's really, really, really important, and something that's not always talked about so much, and does seem to vary by institution. Like I went to a very small institution for my undergrad where there was like a lot of emphasis put on like relationships between students and lecturers and stuff, whereas I've heard of like other institutions literally a 10-minute walk away where academics won't give a student the time of day. So it's kind of
it's confusing. And actually like that point was something else from Malika's interview I thought was really interesting, where she kind of talked about I think it was like with presenting or with other stuff, like she'd had really positive experiences, like not to cut people being quite supportive within academia. And like I think a lot of time on like Twitter and other places it seems like academics are really mean. It's sometimes what you get the impression, and that hasn't been my experience yet, obviously early days and everything, but it's been very positive and supportive. And like you said, Seren, it's like I think what my supervisors helped me through the process of applying as well, and they were all really nice during that process. So it's like, you know, you can see that there are people who are trying to have that good relationship. And it was nice to hear Malika say that, because I was like, oh yeah, that's how I'm feeling right now. But sometimes, you know, when you hear people complaining and then you're like, I'm having a great time, you just sound like a dickhead. So you don't want to be like, oh no, I haven't had that. But yeah, that was another point that stuck out to me.
So those are our key takeaways from this week's interview with Malika. Thanks so much, Malika, for being such an awesome guest.
So that's it from us for now. Thanks for listening to Bending Boundaries, a podcast sponsored by the Northwest Social Science Doctoral Training Partnership, which aims to encourage a broader range of applicants to showcase our work and the work of others and amplify the intersectional voices of diverse PhD students.
We'll be back with our next guest in 1 month's time.
In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or want to tell us a bit more about how you're bending boundaries in or out of academia, tweet us at @BendingBoundariesPod, or follow us on Instagram at BendingBoundariesPodcast, or you can even email us at bendingboundariespod@gmail.com. Okay, bye.
Thank you. See you next time.